Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's so good to be with you again. They say the mark of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and again and hoping for a different outcome. So I have no idea why you invited me back. Shall we pray? Father God, it's good to be together. We thank you that we experience the blessing of fellowship tonight with each other and with your Spirit. And we ask that we may be enriched simply by virtue of being here. Lord Jesus, what we talk about tonight is something that has affected all of us. And while there's a technical and academic component to this, we recognize too that this is a lived experience. It's something that affects us, that impacts our families and our loved ones. And we ask that somehow, as we're engaging our minds, that you would also be speaking to our hearts. And that, again, because of your presence, we may find that we're a little further along on our own personal journeys because of the time that we've spent together. So we bless you for this church family, for this building, for those who tend and care for this congregation. And we honor you that because of them we can be here tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I'm going to tell you about this bowl of sweets a little later on, but to invite you to grab some and pass it along. It's a bit heavy, so we're going to charge you for a gym workout fee at the same time as well. Thanks, Patsy. So let's hope. So when it comes to the presentation, my apologies. I used all these fancy fonts, but neglected to consider that maybe the Strubitz Valley laptop doesn't have them, so they don't all align. So I think you'll still be able to read what's on the screen anyway. So tonight we're talking about grief, and we're going to start off by looking at this image. As you can see, this person's having a smashing time. Any of you ever hit your thumb with a hammer before? Or slammed a finger in a door before? Okay, quite a pleasant experience? Okay, all right. I'm the son of a motor mechanic, and Dad was phenomenal. He had these massive sausage-like fingers, and he could put in the tiniest screw. He was just so adept at everything. And of course, you always try and be like your father. And I was blessed with the antithesis of every gift he had. And so I smashed my thumb and my nose and my ear and probably everything else trying to put a nail in a piece of wood before. So I want us just to think of that experience for a moment. So you've got the nail pinched between your fingers, the hammer, and you smack your thumb. In that moment, you know what you've done. And in your head, you usually say, oh, I'll let you fill in the blank. Okay, oh dear, there we go. The pain hasn't hit yet. Do you agree? The pain hasn't hit yet, but you know that the pain is coming. You know that it's on its way. Usually, oh, that's all for me. You were so generous, thank you. You know the pain is on, and what do we usually do in that moment? We drop the hammer and we grab our thumb and we wait for that to throb, and then it kicks in. And then you usually use one of those descriptive words again. And then you're standing there and you're holding it, and now you've got a decision to make. Am I going to look, or am I just going to stand here and hold my thumb? And you get the curious who want to know immediately what's going on, see if they can see some bone sticking through or something like that, blood squirting all over the place. And then you get those who just don't want to look. And, they just wish it would go away. Eventually you reach some point where you know you've got to deal with your smashed thumb. So you take your hand away to inspect the damage. At that point you have to make a decision. Emergency room, or am I just being a big fat baby? And when you look at the damage, you assess what your next action is going to be. Usually you just think, oh, okay, and put a little plaster on, and then you go and try and hammer the nail in the piece of wood again, and you're a whole lot more cautious this day. Isn't that true? Okay. When you smack your thumb and someone else is around, what do they usually do? They want to come and help them. Oh, are you okay? And all the rest. And usually our immediate response is irritation. Just leave me, I will deal with this, Usually, not always. Now, strangely enough, this is a metaphor for the whole grief process. So, your reaction to smashing your thumb with a hammer is identical to our experience of grief and loss. So, the person dies, and we end up in shock. And we're almost numb. And then the pain hits. And we don't know what to do with the pain. And we're scared of it. And we run from the pain. And we do that in different ways. Some people just pretend they're okay. Some people keep themselves as busy as they can. Some people will revert to coping mechanisms like alcohol and tablets and things like that. And it takes some time before you have the confidence to confront that pain, to look at it. When you look at that pain, you have to decide how are you going to cope. So I was related to someone who used to faint at the sight of blood, and she was working, servicing sewing machines, a home economics teacher, and she forgot that the pedal was still attached to the machine, and she got the point in her thumb, and she knew that if she looked, she would faint. And so she clasped her thumb, ran to the office, and went like this, and then fainted. And we don't always know how we're going to react when we confront that pain, that grief, whether we check out, whether we face it head on, whether it destroys us, whether it emboldens us. But when we confront that grief, then we have to make decisions about how we're going to move forward. And when we go back to normal life, hammering a nail in, we live life differently from how we did before. So if you're hammering a nail in a second time, you're either waiting for the pain, or you're doing it a whole lot more carefully. Maybe you're holding the nail with a pair of pliers, or maybe you've got someone else to do it because you know you're not coping so well. And so the whole grief process changes our experience of life. And so whenever you think of that whole journey of grief, I want you to think of hitting your thumb with a hammer, because it's the epitome of our emotional experience. And so tonight we're going to look at some technical aspects, we're going to look at some emotional aspects, and then we're going to finish with a reflection. Part of the difficulty of this topic is that we could talk about it for about 6 hours non-stop. So if I go a little bit quickly, please just throw a shoe at me if you have any questions, or wave a hanky or something, and we'll stop and take any questions that we might have. So, the reaction to hitting your thumb with a hammer is almost identical to your reaction to grief. Now, what's so important for us to remember, that although we go through this process, and although we always have the scars, we may readjust to approaching life once again, that the level of experiences and intensities is going to be different for everybody. It's not going to be the same. And we're going to have a look at, as we talk about it, we're going to have a look at the different experiences, although it covers the same themes. Does that make sense? So everyone will experience shock, but will experience shock in a different way. In the Kubler-Ross method of grief, they talk about denial. Don't like the word denial. I think shock is a better word to describe it, because the fact that you're not functioning is not denying the grief, it's because of of the grief. And it's like when you've hit your thumb that first second, and you know that you're in trouble, and you're sort of catching your breath before the pain hits. So let me ask you a simple question. In your mind, what is grief? What is grief? Any thoughts? Brokenheartedness. Okay, good.
It's an emotion.
It's an emotion. Excellent. Good. Any other thoughts? What causes grief? Separation. And that's lovely, because you can grieve a divorce. You can grieve children emigrating. You can grieve a child growing up because they don't need you anymore. You know, when they reach that lovely, delightful age of about 15 and 16 and they want to assert their independence, and you just want to cuddle your little baby, and they say, "Don't come and watch me play hockey. I'm embarrassed." And so you, "Don't kiss me," exactly. I won't, I promise. You were talking, okay, right, I misunderstood. And any loss, any separation is grief. You know, when we get old like me, and you don't function like you used to, we grieve who we were. And so grief comes to us in so many different ways. And obviously tonight we're talking primarily about the loss of a loved one. But this can be true of being retrenched. Anything like that. You know, my greatest psychological trauma comes from grief caused by the fact that Milky Bar is no longer made with the original chocolate. It's now that plastic dream stuff. I have sought therapy for it. It's not working. So loss comes to us in so many different ways, and yet we experience it with those common experiences, and that's what we're going to explore tonight. So, how does grief affect our bodies? Okay, first and foremost, we experience physiological changes. So with intense grief, you will stop sleeping, or you will sleep too much. You will lose weight, or you will gain a whole lot of weight. You can experience panic attacks, heart palpitations, sweating, dry mouth, difficulties with your digestive system, nausea, shaking. Literally, your body undergoes changes. And it's your body's way of reacting to the chemical changes that we'll talk about just now. And so, whenever someone's undergone an intense grief, part of the stress of the loss is suddenly even their body changes. And that causes stress and confusion. It's almost a double blow. Does that make sense? Okay. And they don't know what to do with this. And so physiologically, there's always huge changes. And then your immune system is affected. So one of the hormonal changes that we go through is we get excess adrenaline. We're in fight or flight mode. And that destroys our white blood cells. And that diminishes our immune system. So usually, if you experience loss, in about 5 to 6 weeks, you can expect to get sick. Infection, flu, cold, and it's just the destruction of the immune system. So I always encourage folk who've been through a traumatic time, as I said last time, get a vitamin B injection, because that always helps to bolster those white blood cells. Sleep changes. So adrenaline, cortisol affects melatonin, and that's your sleep chemical in your brain. And so usually you sleep far less, and you struggle to sleep because it reduces melatonin. And so, and that's okay. You know, when you're hurting and you're broken, and for a few weeks, that's okay. But obviously, for a prolonged period, you may need to get some medical intervention with that. But it's very normal. Some folk are in such shock that they need to hide, and they just sleep the whole time. And that's their way of avoiding the pain. Our brain chemistry changes. So the hormones I've been mentioning, cortisol, adrenaline, melatonin, all of this is affected. And it literally can put you into depression. It affects your ability to concentrate. It makes you more edgy, more agitated. And literally, it's not you being unreasonable. It's the chemical changes that take place in your brain. And again, you need to allow yourself time and patience to say, this is what it is right now. In time, it should stabilize. Of course, if it doesn't, then we need some professional intervention. That's dependent on you having a brain. So it never affected me in any way whatsoever. All right. Okay. And then our mental capacity. Focus is the single biggest thing. And you feel like you can't concentrate on one thought. And it's almost like your thoughts are consumed by the pain, if that makes sense. And so someone will say something to you, you won't hear it. Or you're trying to finish a job at work, and you just keep on getting distracted all the time. And literally your brain feels like scrambled eggs. And again, that's all the chemical changes. So your short-term memory goes, your ability to focus and concentrate goes, your irritation levels increase. And people, when they've lost a loved one, will say to you, I don't feel like myself. I don't recognize myself, because you're not. And it's that natural fight or flight response to the experience that you're going through. And then aspirational changes. So basically, we'll look forward to a holiday, or we'll have dreams, or we'll have plans to grow, or to have hope for the future, or families, or whatever. The positive things that we're looking forward to. And suddenly they don't count anymore. So let's go back to smashing our thumb with a hammer. When you hit your thumb with a hammer, you're not going to sit down and go, oh, I'm so excited about the holiday we've planned next July. Because you have no capacity to think about that. All you can think about and experience is the pain in your finger. And so this is just a very brief summary of how we experience physiologically our grief. And these words are so inadequate to describe the full breaking, diminishing pain that you go through when you lose someone you love. I'm sure all of you have experienced loss before, losing someone close to you. Okay. Does this ring true for you? Okay. Does it sound familiar? And of course, our experiences will be different. So Alan shared with us last time, when his wife passed away, that there was a sense of relief because she was no longer suffering. And we will look at those things in a moment. All right. Everyone okay? Anyone want to ask any questions about how we experience it physically? Are we all good? Yes, Jackie?
I think, and I mean, sorry, you might be coming to it later, but I think for me, one of the biggest effects for me has been helplessness.
Oh, absolutely.
The
That's
feeling
excellent.
of helplessness is just
totally
overwhelming. You can't change it.
That's right. We fix things, don't we? We live in a world where we fix things. Your car breaks down, you fix your car. You have a mental breakdown, you go and see a mental health professional. You get to come and talk on grief, or you find a better person to speak next week. You can fix things. You can't fix this. You can't undo it. And we try and make substitutes, and there's nothing that can replace. You are literally half a person. It's like half of you's been taken away. That's so helpful, absolutely. Utter helplessness. Yes, Alan?
You were talking about pain and then avoidance. When my wife died, yes, I was relieved. But was that a form of avoidance?
It can be, absolutely. Because, if you look at the Kubler-Ross model, which we're going to look at just now, the third phase, not that it's chronological, it even works systematically through the phases, is bargaining. And bargaining is, she's died, but I'm okay because it's a relief. And we try and rationalize the whole thing. Very good, absolutely right. So that is a form of avoidance. So the holding onto the thumb, why do we do that? Because there's a sense that maybe if I squeeze, the pain is not going to, and that's like the shock, absolutely. And shock is a protective mechanism, but we're going to talk more about that in a moment. Okay, any other questions about our reactions or experiences of it? Half a person, I love that. You are literally paralyzed. So
you've got to have a crutch, and it's finding that crutch
that gets you through. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. All right. So one of the complexities with grief is the experience of grief is common, but we all experience grief differently. And we'll look at some of the things that affect us in a moment. So because of this, there are so many different models of grief. So what do we talk about a model of grief? It's psychologists who have looked at grief and they've tried to put grief in a framework that we can use to resolve or work through in a particular way. And I think I've got 6 that I'm going to talk through very, very quickly with you to give you an idea of the different ways in which people look at grief. So the most obvious one was designed by Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. Most of you will know, and that's traditionally the 5 stages of grief: denial, shock, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, the thing about the Kubler-Ross stages is that Elisabeth didn't design them in reflection of people who had died and the experiences thereof, or the loved ones thereof. She discovered those stages working with people who were in hospice, who were anticipating their own death, and yet it seems to be true for both. As I've mentioned before, these stages, which we're going to look at just now, are not you do one and then the next one and then the next one and the next one. They overlap, they intermingle, you go from one to the other. But we will look at this in more detail just now. Then Freud, oh my word, look at my awesome spelling. Mourning. I'm not a morning person, so morning and morning are the same thing to me. So Freud talks about 2 poles. He says there's a normal process of mourning and separation, and then there's a process of melancholia. He says melancholia is where your grief is out of the ordinary, where it's extreme. And so you have a healthy grief, and then you have an extreme grief. And of course he relates that back to your childhood experiences that we don't need to go into. Warden is very interesting. He says, when we grieve, we've got to fulfill 4 different tasks. We've got to fulfill 4 different tasks in order to get through the other to the other side of grieving. I'm doing this from memory. The first task is acceptance. I've got to accept that the person has died. The second task is I've got to process my emotional experience at their death. So I've got to sit down and think about and feel what I'm going through. The third task when it comes to Warden is to adjust to the fact that this person's no longer here. So, if it's maybe like a husband who would always do the banking, or if it's a mother who would always phone with my problems, or a child that I'd be responsible for, I have to learn to adjust to the fact that they're no longer a part of my life and those things aren't happening anymore. And then the last one is you've got to create new relationships. You've got to adjust to a new way of living and to deal with new things in a new way with a new approach. And he says the process of finding healing through grief is achieving these different tasks. Everyone okay with that? Okay, good. Struber and Schutt talk about a Jub process. They say grieving, and similar to the previous one, is about coming to terms with what you can't fix, with what's been taken from you. And when you've done that, then you can start looking forward to living life in a new way. All right. Bowlby and Park, they talk about attachment theory. Now, attachment theory is based on how do we experience relationships, how do we make connections with other people. And it makes sense. If you're a sociopath, any sociopaths here? That laugh worries me. if you're a sociopath and someone dies, you're not going to feel it. But if you're in a codependent relationship and you define yourself with the other person, it's going to destroy you. So it makes sense that in terms of attachment theory, I I just want to check the notes here to make sure that I'm not lying to you. They talk about working through shock and numbness, yearning and searching, disorder and despair, and then reorganization. And so basically in terms of attachment, if you think of those headings, they talk about how we experience the detachment and then how can we learn to attach again. And so disorganization, we reattach through organization. So the shock, what's going on? Okay, what do I need to do to resolve that? And then we deal with that. And so their process is a transformative one where the whole model is about how do I reattach to myself, to the loved one, to the people around me. Everyone okay with that? Okay, good. I know this is very technical. Lindemann talks about our grief reactions, and very similar to the previous one is Lindemann encourages us to look at how we've reacted to the shock and the hurt, and then how we can take those reactions and use them to drive a new way of living. And so my partner of 60 years has died. We used to talk about everything. That's come to an end. How do I find a new way of experiencing that kind of company and support that I had with my loved ones? We're nearly there. And then class is very interesting in that class talks about continuing bonds. So all the previous theories talk about how do we deal with the fact that this person's been taken from us. Class comes along and says, well, actually, how in our grief can we continue to maintain a relationship with the deceased? And we do that by memories. We do that by learning from the lessons of their lives. And then we do that through certain rituals. So, for example, in the African context, the whole idea of the ancestors who look after you and still have a relationship with you. And then Romans chapter 8, Paul speaks of how there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God through Christ our Lord, not even death. And so we recognize there's still love that's continuing between the deceased and ourselves. So class tries to encourage people to maintain that connection. Make sense? Okay, excellent. And then the last thing, the last theory, is something called the systems model. And that recognizes that grief doesn't only affect you as an individual, it affects the whole system. And so, if a father dies, it affects the mother, but then it also affects children. And you may find the oldest son trying to take the father's role, or the mother trying to be the father's, let's just say cliche disciplinarian role. And the whole system gets messed up. So for example, if the husband dies and the husband drove and the wife didn't, now the children have to take the wife to church and shopping and things like that. Do you see how the whole thing gets just turned on its head? And so it's so important to remember that grief does not exist in a vacuum. And then the last system, the last theory, which I left off there, is the most important one. Have you all heard of Viktor Frankl? He's written a profound book called Man's Search for Meaning. He was a psychiatrist before the Second World War, and he was put into a neurosurgeon and a psychiatrist. And he was put into Auschwitz, the death camp in the Second World War. And he watched these prisoners of war and tried to understand why some of them lived in such a heinous environment successfully and why some just gave up. And he realized that those who found meaning in their grief or their loss or their incarceration or in their torture were the ones who overcame, and those who couldn't find meaning. And for him, when it comes to grief work, the most important thing is that we find a meaning in our loss, not something that substantiates the loss or the suffering, but in spite of the loss or the suffering, that we can find a purpose in it. So maybe because of my own suffering, I can help someone else who's suffering. So my suffering's not wasted. Or maybe it's caused me to draw closer to God with my questions. Or maybe it's inspired me to live my life more. Or not to take people for granted. If we can find purpose, then we have a reason to continue. And so the reason I've shared all these different models with you is just to give you an idea of how vast it is. How vast the impact is of we can approach it from a different point of view. And so we're going to have a look at an exploration of grief in terms of how it affects us as individuals. So the first thing that affects our grief is our personal worldview. So as you sit here, each of you have your own approach to the world that is different. So I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up, but how many of you don't put your hands up? We're going to vote ANC. How many of you are going to vote DA? How many of you are going to vote for the AAC? I think they're right on the top of the voters roll. Do you know who they are? I don't either. Okay. How many are going to vote for the MK party? Okay. So each of you can have a different opinion, not so? And maybe have the same opinion, but you have different reasons. And so grief affects us according to the worldview that we had before the death. And so if some of us really have a strong connection with heaven and a sense of eternity and confidence in Christ, the grief may be easier for us. If others are atheists, and we think when you die, that's the end of it, it's going to affect us differently. If some of us, as I say, are codependents, the grief will be worse. Some of us are independent. The grief will be different. And so how we experience the loss will be informed by our perception of the world before the death even takes place. And of course our personalities, and who we are. Some of us are go-getters. No matter what happens, we just keep on going. Others of us just like crumple and we soppy and emotional, and all of that affects who we are. Secondly, our personality and attachment. So if we are dependent on other people, we're going to feel the loss more. If we've always been independent, it's not to say we won't hurt, but we will deal with it differently and we'll go out there and carry on with life. But what's important about these two things is we may have a perception of ourselves and how well we deal with things. And then grief hits us and we discover we're not that person. We may think we're independent and strong, and then grief hits us and then we realize, actually we're not. Then we're grieving the loss and we're grieving who we thought we were. Does that make sense? Okay. And so it's like a double grief. Jackie's getting so excited at the back, yes.
Two questions of that. I think the one where we grieve who we are, it can also, because it can affect our relationship with God. I would never question God. I have this unshakable faith. And then something terrible happens and suddenly you're like, God, where are you?
That's right.
And again, your whole perception of who you are, because I would never question God, and now suddenly you're questioning God.
Yeah.
But I was curious as well, does it not also, like you talked about attachment styles, is there not, I want to say, a danger that you lose someone very close to you and you go, I'm never going to love like that ever again?
Absolutely.
Because it's too dangerous, the loss is too great, I can't do that ever again.
You remember me saying when you try and hammer a nail in again after hitting your thumb, you're so much more tentative because you've been hurt. Absolutely right. And some people do that. Other people go, I can't deal with this on my own, and they're married in 6 weeks. Are you with me? Yeah, absolutely. And the faith thing, very much so. And again, we feel like we have all our ducks in a row, and then someone dies, and we realize we don't. It's quite hard to
That's
come
when
to
you
terms with
realize
that.
that one is maybe a pigeon.
A pigeon.
No, instead of a duck. Well, they're actually all squirrels and they're at a rave.
That deserves a sucker, Ellen. I'm going to throw it at you because the cord's not that long.
Wow.
Oh gosh, I love that. Okay, and then your role in the system. So if you're a child and someone you love dies, you feel helpless as a child. You don't understand your emotions, and you're going to experience it in a very different way. You're going to be overwhelmed and lost, and you want to help your dad, but you don't know what to do. If you're the father and you've got children, you subdue your grief because now you've got to look after them, in the whole system. I was visiting someone last night. Her husband is at the beginning of dementia. She's having surgery, and she says, I'm so scared to die. I said, why are you scared to die? She said, because who's going to look after him if I die? And so we never die or we never experience grief in isolation. It affects a whole family, a whole community. At church, someone does door duty and they pass away. That affects the community. We never die in isolation. And how you experience it will be affected by the role that person plays. What's his name? 20 Habits of Highly Effective People. Thank you. Stephen Covey starts his book with an illustration of a father being on a train. He's got a baby in his arms, a toddler and a teenager, and they're misbehaving. And someone berates him and says to him, how can you allow your children to behave this way? They're disruptive. And he looks up at this man and he says, I'm so sorry. My wife has just died and I don't know what to do. So his role has just changed completely. And so it depends on the role that we played. So many times with the loss of parents, the children will say to me, I used to message my mother every day, and I've got no one to message now. Or I used to tell them, and this was my experience. I had a friend I was close to, died about a year ago, and we'd always be in touch, and I'm doing this, I'm going here, and all the rest. And after she died, I realized that if I didn't make it home, no one would know. This little thing like that, no one would miss me. My secretary would think I'm just taking a day off because I do that all the time. Just like Jake. All right. And then your pre-existing relationship with the person who's died. If you hated their guts, thank you, Jesus, for solving that problem for me. Okay. Sorry if I'm being flippant. But if you were close to them, it's devastating. What was fascinating for me when my dad died is that I did not understand the relationship that I had with him until he was gone. I played down the relationship I had with him. I mean, we loved each other and all the rest, Didn't realize how critical he was in my life until he wasn't there anymore. I have never heard of, and I pray it's never true, that someone thought they had a good relationship then discovered they didn't need them. I don't think that's ever happened. But based on our pre-existing relationship will affect how we experience the grief of that person. And then the nature of the death. Okay, so your wife's been sick, you've watched them suffer, you've watched them hurt. You love them so much you do not want them to hurt anymore. We experience the loss and everything, but there's a consolation that they've found healing. And it's almost a contradiction, it's almost worse in a way, because you're hurting because they're not here, but you're relieved that they're not suffering anymore, and you don't quite know which feeling to embrace. If there's a car accident and they die tragically, God, how can you allow this to happen? Illness, how can you allow this to happen? Suicide, hugely complicated, because I should have done something more. Why did they do it? Why didn't they talk to me? Etc., etc., etc. All the complexities. And we could spend a whole night talking about all of these. You lose a child. How can God take someone like that? A miscarriage, even worse, because we live in a world that is so visually based that the world cannot understand that for the mother that as a living person. You've already got dreams and aspirations. You've got a name for the child. You're planning what school you're already in relationship with that. And so now you've got to deal with your grief, but you've also got to deal with people who don't understand your grief. You know, your father does. Everyone knows how to deal with it. Miscarriage, people don't. Suicide, people don't know how to talk to you about that. Because, do you blame yourself? Did you do something wrong? Did they do? Are you with me? And so you have all these complications in terms of grief. Okay. Post-death support. So you don't belong to a community, to a church. You're on your own. Your wife of 60 years dies. Your children are overseas. It's going to be tougher for you than it is if you're in an environment of people who are just there, who are non-judgmental, who are available for you. Does that make sense? Okay, it's not something we always think about. Often I found people where the loved ones have said, oh, they don't have a funeral, they don't make a fuss, they don't realize how important it is for those who've left behind, and there's no closure, and there's no support in that process. Sometimes you'll find there's conflicts over wills, families are fighting with each other, all that kind of stuff. So again, there's no space for people to support each other. They're busy competing, and that affects your experience of grief. Post-death complications. So again, maybe the main breadwinner dies. Now you're worrying about how you're going to survive. You're not processing your grief. Maybe your parent has died, but you've got young children that demand your attention. You've got to continue to look after them and deny the journey or the pain you're going through. Sometimes post-death complications come from the people around you who have their own opinions about how you should be experiencing this. And you end up feeling guilty, going, is there something wrong with me? You know, everyone says, oh, you should be so relieved she's not suffering. I'm not relieved. I'm angry that God has taken it from me. But now I feel guilty. Should I be relieved? We people have expectations that are laid on us. All right. So what we're going to do is go through a journey of grief based on Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. But this one has been expanded, and it deals with the processing of the experience. So you'll see the ... on the left there. I don't know if you can read it from there. It talks about normal functioning and the assumptions that we're all normal. Very dangerous. Okay. And then at the end, return to meaningful life. Not life as it was. It's never the same again. But return to a meaningful life. So we start off with shock and denial. And you'll see there avoidance, confusion, fear, numbness, and blame. So basically, when you hit your thumb, you will react in a way that you cannot predict and you do not know. So if you encounter a traumatic situation and you enter fight or flight mode, you do not know how you're going to react in that space. So Eric Heimer, I think he was 86, in Port Elizabeth. He was walking through St. George's Park. 3 knife-wielding men accosted him. Next thing he looked down, they were all unconscious on the floor. He had been a boxer in the Navy. A colleague of mine was hijacked in his driveway. 4th Dan, black belt, karate, held up by a young teenage boy with a knife, and he fainted. We have no idea how we're going to react, and we have no idea how we're going to deal with the shock when it happens. Some people scream, some people go quiet, some people are very controlled. We are not in control of how we deal with that moment. And you find people apologizing for how they react. You know, they think, oh, I should have done this, or I should have done that. And it's almost like a buffer that gives us a second to think about what we're going to do before the pain hits. Are you with me? Okay. So a colleague of ours, Chunky Young, he passed away a few years ago from an aneurysm, but 5 years prior to that, his wife Carol died of cancer. And I remember him saying to me the one day, if he had comprehended immediately the full weight of the loss, he would have died on the spot. And so denial and shock is God's way of helping us to catch our breath until we are ready to deal with it. I have a problem with people who want to force you to confront that on their terms or expect you to react in a particular way. We had a 28-year-old who had been living in Scotland, lost one lung due to a fungal infection, nearly didn't make it, came back to South Africa with his Scottish girlfriend, spoke in church about how God had saved him through this process, and said to me he's got a sore back. And I recommended him to the chiropractor. Went to see her, she said, no, you've got to get x-rays. Discovered he had a tumor and that he had 6 months to live. And all he wanted to do was marry his girlfriend. And everyone said, no, you can't do it, you're in denial. But it was his way of processing it. And one of my greatest pains for him was that he never did, because no one would support him in that. We need to have permission to deal with this as we need to deal with this. And if I need to go on a world cruise and only start crying 6 years later, that is what I need. Obviously, I'm talking constructive dealing with things. Okay? Any questions around that?
Sorry.
You go.
You go.
Age before beauty.
Oh, well, then I'll go.
I just wanted to ask you, there's that one scripture in the Bible where it says, but God will never put you through something that...
God will not test you beyond your ability to endure.
So they use this as an opportunity to say, you see, but God will not.
And God is the ultimate form of denial. Because you're a Christian, because you love God, you can't mourn, you can't break down, you can't. And that's there. Why? Because they cannot deal with your pain. And so we write it off. Does that make sense? And they may mean well, but it's easier to quote scripture and say, you will be fine, than it is to sit someone in there with their pain. It's a whole lot messier.
Thank you.
All happy with that?
Thank you.
Oh no, it's fine. Take your time.
The day after my dad passed, we went to the people for the funeral.
Oh, the undertakers, yeah.
And we were sitting there discussing the funeral and everything. And they asked about the ashes, my dad's ashes, and my mum said she didn't want it. I couldn't understand. That was my anger coming out, but it was her denial.
That's right.
That was very, I couldn't.
And the problem is that in that moment, you're grieving, and you can't sit back and cognate, okay, this is what's going on. We deal with it the best way that we can in that situation. And for you, you'd feel like, why are you rejecting Dad like that? Why? You know, it would feel like she's absolutely right. Totally right. And that makes sense that you would feel that way, you know. And if you asked your mom, well, why don't you want his ashes? She wouldn't be able to even articulate it in a way.
You know, and then I took the ashes and I said, I'm going to take it to where his dad, his mum and his sisters where they are. And the day I started arranging my travel arrangements to go, my mum was like, but I'm going with you. I'm going to do this. And I was like, but why now?
Yeah.
Why now?
Yeah.
You didn't want to.
That's right.
But
Maybe she was angry at the time. Maybe she's even angry with him for dying.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So at that point in time, that was then, I think, her dealing with, I'm letting you go.
That's right. That's right. She had had time to process. Absolutely right. That's so helpful. Thank you. Anyone else?
You know, I just want to say, when I was much younger, I was quite new at work. My boss's mom died, and he wasn't at work when I went to go and get a signature for something, and his secretary said his mom had passed away, and then 2 hours later, there he was, like nothing had happened. And of course, I thought he was despicable already,
Right.
so that didn't help.
That's right.
It's disgusting.
That's
He
right.
doesn't even care that
How
his mom died.
disrespectful, exactly.
Doesn't even care. So I had formed a judgment on that, you know, the way that he was dealing with it, maybe the only way he could cope with it, and especially probably more so men than women, that trying to keep
They try
it
and keep
together.
themselves busy.
And
That's
so
right.
he just got on with it and whatnot. He may have disappeared for a couple of hours for her funeral later in the week, and that was the sum total of what we could see,
Right.
his grief. And, you know, about 2 weeks after my husband died, we weren't in a great place before he died. And somebody very, very close to me, as close as a sister, I grew up with her, came round, walked into the kitchen, and I'd been crying. And she said, "Aren't you over it yet?"
Wow.
So I've been on both sides of that
That's right.
judgment.
That's right.
And we all just so different,
And
dealing with things differently. You've got
That's right.
the judges have got personalities, and so have the grievers. And maybe just as you get older, you kind of more accepting
That's right.
of the grievers and
That's
the
right.
judges and
of
whatever, and
everyone's
just
right
thinking
to grieve
comes
as
from
they want to.
somewhere that
Indeed.
misunderstanding.
That's right.
Yeah, we're all just different.
And that's the double burden.
Yeah. And the shock of immediately afterwards, how life just carries on for everybody else.
That was the worst thing. You see traffic cops on the side of the road pulling over cars, and you think, what are you doing? My dad's dead. You know, how are you carrying on? And someone phones you and says, "Oh, will you do a funeral for me? Or will you put a notice in the intimation sheet?" "I don't care. You know, my friend's dead. Why?" You know, totally right.
The world will not stop.
The shock. I never experienced, you know, people I knew passed away, my granddad. And yes, as a child, you don't really understand. But in that moment, the shock also, even with hospital, 3 o'clock that morning when they came and they said, "Which morgue are we sending the body to?" And I'm like,
It's so graphic, and yeah.
and it's like, "Yeah, we need the dead." I'm like,
Yeah,
"Oh my
that's right.
God.
This is my dad. How exactly.
Can you just give us time
That's
to
right.
process?"
That's right.
So that the total shock, I think, starting from the death, immediately, and the things you need to deal with is that put you into how you deal with the rest
That's
of
right.
the grief.
That's right.
How you
It
going to
impacts the rest
process
of the
it.
journey.
Yeah.
Totally right.
You know, you also said just now about if your colleague or friend, when he lost his wife, he said if he'd realised how it was the bigness of it at the
Yes,
time, he
that's
just
right,
would have
yes.
fluxed on the
Yeah.
spot. And Clancy and I have also discussed that, you know, when someone you love dies, it seems so brutal that you have to step into action immediately.
Yes.
Where's the body going? Who's
That's
gonna
right.
and how you're gonna do this? You've got all the strip and paperwork, and you've got to decide the way forward and deal with an estate and everything. And it just seems so unfair, unrealistic, everything, because you just want to grieve. But
Yeah.
actually, I wonder if that kind of doesn't
Force you.
force you to just not have it all down on
That's
your
right.
head in one go. So
Yeah.
you have moments where, like, questions like that. I remember having to go and go to the morgue that day,
Yeah.
and I was just the thought that my dad was there somewhere
Yeah.
in this place, you know, and I was just overcome. But they had to sign the papers, and so it's not to say that you don't fall apart periodically, but having to just think rationally and make decisions and deal with the business of it
Forces you to
almost
function.
kind of not softens the blow, but draws it out a bit, maybe.
Distracts
And-
you.
yeah,
Yeah.
a little
Which we're
bit.
going to talk. That's
Yeah,
excellent. That's a great
yeah.
observation.
For me, something that stood out, I had a stillborn.
carried him out in one of those carry cots. It was just so touching to me
Yeah,
that they respected him enough
that's right.
to not parade him.
And to recognize his humanity and dignity in that way.
He didn't survive. That was just a little thing that made me happy in that moment. They respected me enough. I did enough.
They carried him out like a baby, not a dead person. Yeah.
Wow. Isn't that amazing? And those are like the little angels that come along in the midst of our grief that help us to cope. And you get both. You get those that are so insensitive, and you get those that are so gracious. That was really beautiful to do. Shame. Okay. Oops. Let's have a look. So the next thing is anger. So anger's source. Now I don't know if you know that anger is a secondary emotion. So anger is not a primary emotion. So no one ever feels anger first. Anger always follows another emotion. Does that make sense? Okay. So the reason why we experience anger is the helplessness that Jakey spoke about earlier. So anger is a secondary emotion will come from fear or from helplessness. And they always say like depression is anger turned inwards. Or that sense of loss, that sense of being let down by God, let down by the person who's abandoned us by dying, anger at ourselves because we didn't do something or feel responsible in some way. And anger is a pure expression of helplessness linked to an elevated adrenaline level, which gives you a fuse that big. And thirdly, it comes from the fact when a loved one dies, you don't care anymore. You don't care about making people happy. You don't care about self-preservation. There's almost a recklessness when a loved one dies. Does that make sense? Okay. And so anger can be a huge issue, but it really comes from that sense of helplessness, from a chemical reaction, and from the reaction that, someone pushes in front of you in the queue, you're not going to fight with them. You don't cause a scene in a shop. We are civilized people. It is what it is. But if your loved one has just died, how dare you? You're going to take them out because you really don't care. Does that make sense? Okay.
That guy who trained with his children,
Yes.
he had
A different experience. And look, he was in the shock phase, still. And he was still overwhelmed. But the moment and you see, anger's a way of taking control back. I know that sounds crazy, but if I'm feeling overwhelmed and something irritates me and I get angry at it, I am taking power back because I feel powerless. So anger can be really useful and constructive as long as you don't have a gun. All right. And as long as you don't burn bridges. And what I found so helpful when it comes to grief is to say to people, look, I am struggling. I apologize if I'm short with you. And so you give yourself a little bit of permission, before you get there. And it's important to explain to your children if they're involved, and the young children, what's going on, because you don't want to alienate them. And then it's helpful to tell people what you need. I'm going to be short, I'm going to be irritable. Please just bear with me, and we'll figure it out. Or when I get angry, just give me space. Tell them what you need. It's okay. Everyone all right with that? Okay. The next thing you'll see there's depression and detachment. And so, shock, I'm helpless, I try and regain power by getting angry. And you know what happens? It doesn't work. I can't get the person back. I can't feel better. And I'm now defeated. Make sense? And I die with the person who's gone. You know that feeling? I've lost myself now. It's like, I'm sure you've seen the Comrades marathons right at the end, and everyone's trying to get over, and they're all limp, and they fall, and this person's struggling and struggling, and just before they get to the line, the gunshot goes. And that's how you feel. You're lying there and there is nothing left. All right. You felt that. Okay. There's a wonderful man, I forget his name, he was a pastoral counselor, he's passed on. He says, in those moments, the best thing we can do is lean into the pain, is to own this and say, I am done. I am defeated. I'm not putting on a brave face. This death has destroyed me. Because it's only when we own that brokenness that we can begin to deal with it. So I've smashed my thumb with a hammer. I'm going to go carry on as per normal. Got a very strange guy in our congregation, genuinely, and not being nasty or judgmental. And he cut his thumb into the bone with an angle grinder. And he took some masking tape, and he just wrapped some masking tape, and he walked around for 3 months. And like every time he came to church, I was thinking, oh Jesus, when he takes that off, his thumb's going to fall off.
Oh, shame.
I don't know what's going on in there. You know, and every week you expect to see maggots and all sorts of things. True's nuts. He took it off and his thumb was perfect.
Wow.
I'm not advocating that as medical advice. And the reason I'm reciting this is to tell you that it doesn't work that way. We have to own the brokenness and the grief. And we have to be able to say, I am done. But do you know that is one of the most beautiful and sacred things you can do? And I know that sounds ridiculous. But if you find yourself on the floor and broken, where there is nothing left, you are saying, I loved this person so much that it's left me here. Can you see the beauty of that? Your pain and your paralysis and your brokenness is a sacred, reverent expression of your love for the person who has died. We live in a world where we live to get rid of pain. And this is the one time where pain it's terrible, but it's beautiful. Does that make sense? Ask someone who's got diabetes, whose legs are being amputated because they have no feeling and they keep on damaging it. Someone who has leprosy keeps on getting infected fingers because they don't feel pain. Are you with me? That pain is indicative that you loved this person loved you. All right. Lack of energy, helplessness, and the problem with this is physically you are broken as much as you are emotionally. And all you can do then is look after yourself. Sleep, try and get some food into you, and make sure there's someone with you who's caring for you. Okay, it's the best thing you can do. Dialogue and bargaining. So every now and then in that brokenness, you want to tell someone about why you're hurting so much. And you want to start sharing stories. And you want to keep on talking. Are you with? Does that ring a bell for you? And that's when we're starting to negotiate. I'm broken, but maybe I can find something here that makes sense. And so I start to negotiate my way out of the pain. And I struggle to find meaning for what's happening. Remember Frankel's search for meaning. The reality is you don't and you can't. It is another denial process. But it shows that you've got a will to try and live again. I'm going to try and figure this out. I'm going to try and work this out. Do you see that? So as much as we try and convince ourselves unsuccessfully, the fact that we're trying to do it actually means I want to live again. And that's a sign of hope. It can be a very difficult time because you're organizing funerals at this stage, so you're arguing with the funeral home, you're arguing about the ashes, you're arguing about all sorts of things. If doctors were involved and they're in hospital, you want to sue the doctors, you're angry because they didn't take care of them properly. Are you with me? And as much as that can be awkward and negative, it's a sign of of an increasing will to live again. Okay. Then you've got acceptance. Now, acceptance, the mistake of acceptance is you think I'm feeling okay. It's not. Acceptance is I accept that I feel. I accept I'm not coping. I accept my bargaining's not working. And that is when you begin to process the grief. All right. They've added an extra component to Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. It's called activation. They've just got the word return to meaningful life. But activation is where you start to do positive things again. So you don't just eat for the sake of eating, but maybe you make something new or you enjoy something new. You're still carrying the pain and brokenness. Maybe you get involved and you go to your parents' teachers meeting, or maybe you go and play bowls again, or maybe you make the visiting minister lemon meringue pie.
Nudge, nudge.
I tell you.
Well, how about you make the minister an Australian pie, an Australian man?
What's that? Kilo? A boomerang.
But then it will come back.
Then I'll come back to you. Oh, wait, we call that reflex. But you start to laugh at jokes again. You start to integrate. It doesn't mean the pain's gone. And remember, these stages are not chronological. And you can have 2 stages at once. You can be in anger and bargaining at the same time. You can be depressed and broken. But you've got to change the tire anyway, which we were talking about, the things that we have to do. Are you with me?
It's called, it's called Confucius.
Confucius.
Yeah.
That's right, exactly. And I want you to imagine like clouds of gas. So you know, like these reveal parties where they shoot powdered blue in the air. And I want you to imagine like 6 different colors and they're all exploding. And generally you start with one color and you finish with the next, but they all intermingle and all the rest. And the painful thing is that grief is for the rest of your life. So you lose a husband and your daughter's getting married and there's no one to walk her down the aisle. It hits you again. You enter a new life cycle phase. And you're in the phase of looking back and evaluating your life. You've got to revisit the grief again. You're driving in the car and you're fine, and there's your wedding song on the radio, and you revisit the grief, and it's with you for the rest of your life. And you deal with it better and better and better. But the reality is, and I think it's Warden, I can't remember, one of these models of grief, the person talks about relocating the pain. And they say the pain is initially there. And processing grief is about learning to move it over there so that you can see life ahead, but the grief and loss is always with you.
It's like when you're standing with your back to the ocean and tiny little waves come. I'm talking about 20 years.
Right.
And suddenly a huge wave comes and
That's
knocks
a
you.
beautiful illustration for a 6 years. And then you've got to get up.
And then you've got to get up and you're bawling your
That's
eyes
right.
out. And it was nothing particular.
Absolutely. That is a beautiful illustration. Did you all hear that? Okay. And that's what it is. Why would you want to get over the death of someone you love? Are you with me? Are they that unimportant to you?
My brother, who is a minister,
Mm.
said to his wife, "Why does Patsy speak about David all the time?" And I said, "It's my way
That's right.
of, he might be dead physically, but he's alive
That's right,
spiritually."
that's right. And he's still a part of who you
Yeah.
are. So the reality is, we never heal from grief. And why should we? Because we love this person. But we learn to manage our grief in healthy ways. All right. Okay. I know I'm keeping you late and long. Jake is going to charge you extra for rent. Okay. So Kubler-Ross's model is you'll see the axis on the left is called morale and competence. And basically, if you have a look at the blue line, that is the roller coaster ride that you go on. Shock, denial, depression, experiment, decision, integration. And so what they're talking about there is this roller coaster ride of emotions that you're feeling. You don't know when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen. One day you feel like you wish you were dead. You wake up the next morning and you're feeling fine. You think, oh, I'm feeling happy today. Oh, I feel so guilty. Oh, where did they come from? Must I pretend to be sad? Are you with me? And or you're out with the kids and you're having, and then suddenly something hits you, the wave hits you, and you just, but if you look at that graph, can you see sort of up, down, up? You want to see that increasing over time, where the up gets more and more and more frequent and the down gets less. And the key thing about grief is that you don't get stuck in one stage for longer than 3 to 6 months. So if you're angry for 2 years, I think you need to talk to someone. If you are depressed and you can't get out of your bed for longer than, I would say 6 weeks maximum, you need to talk to someone. So the sign of healthy grieving is that you are moving through the stages. Not necessarily upwards, but you just, because if you're moving, it means you're processing.
Your denial stage can also be long.
Yes.
So I thought I grieved my dad. I didn't grieve. Up until the other day that we got news from my mom. And all that.
It just suddenly came. So this bowl belonged to the friend of mine who passed away. She was a hairdresser, and she had this in her salon, and there were always sweets in there. I don't think people went to have their haircut, they went to get the sweets. And when she died, I made a vow out of my weirdness that this bowl will sit on my desk and it always have sweets in for whoever comes. It was the anniversary of her death last month, and I thought that I had grieved for her. I've been dealing with grief for 30 years, and I went away. I didn't want to be around people for the anniversary, and I realized that I hadn't even started a year later, dealing with the funeral, dealing with the family, with the husband, with the children, and their grief. And as someone who deals with this all, it was a shock. And I know people who 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. And so there is no formula. And that's why I like to talk about these clouds, because there's no rules. My mom lost 4 babies. Sandra lived for 3 days. There was a stillbirth and a miscarriage. And then I only discovered recently I had a brother who lived for 2 days. And it was between my oldest brother and myself. My mom's now 83. And on the 10th of May, I will ask her, how are you? And she will say, I'm not okay. The other date in August, she doesn't always remember. It's in my diary. But when I check on her, that day she's a wreck. 83. So let's say, thumbsuck, 60 years later. Okay. All right, you get a sense of that process. All right, let's some practical tips. Embrace what you need. If you need to be alone, be alone. If you need to be with people, be with people. If you need to laugh and joke, laugh and joke. If you need to be miserable, it's the one time in your life you do not have to apologize for embracing what you need. Okay. See a doctor if you're not sleeping. if you're moving from a grief depression into a clinical depression, if you don't have an appetite, see a doctor, because the doctor can help you deal with your symptoms. All right. So, non-avoidant distraction. So, Gerard Egan, wonderful pastoral counselor, he tells us that if you've got problems, big problems, find a little one that you can solve, because it gives you energy to solve the next one and the next one and the next one. If you're grieving and you're not coping, and you love watching movies, go and binge for 3 days, because that gives you energy to face one little thing. Are you with me? If you need to sleep, you do that so it gives you energy to face one little thing. So when I say non-avoidant distraction, there are things that are unhelpful. A lot of people will turn to alcohol, but of course, alcohol is a depressant, so you just feel worse the next day. That's not helpful. Some people like to go for walks. Some people need time alone, and they need someone to babysit them. Do whatever gives you energy to cope with the next day and the next day. So you're not just avoiding, you're avoiding with a purpose. Make sense? Okay, good. Sorry, I'm going quickly, and I've gone on too long. Guilt-free grief. Never feel guilty for what you're feeling. Ever. Ever. Okay. If you do, go and talk to Jackie and she will slap you. Please be honest with God. I always bring my relationship with God back to my relationship with my children. I remember walking past my son's room, I think I told you last time, and he was crying. He was hiding under his duvet, and I went through and said, James, what's wrong? And he stubbed his toe. And I was broken, not only because he was sore, but that he felt he couldn't come and tell me, And there's nothing worse than a sulky child, and much rather they come to me and say, Dad, you embarrass me, you always use me as sermon illustrations. I'd rather they did that than avoided me. Go to God with how you're feeling. God, I hate you. I hate you because you've taken this innocent unborn child away. How dare you? I hate you because my mother was murdered, but where there's so many other evil people out there who should be dead and not her. God, I don't even know if you exist. God, I don't know what to say to you. Okay? When it's a relationship, and you can only have a relationship if you're honest, God can deal with your grief. All right? He's big enough to deal with your pain. All right, narrative therapy. We tell the story. So I always use fairy tales. Sorry, Jackie, you hear it again. So the story of Little Red Riding Hood. And Little Red Riding Hood's taking cookies to Gran, and she gets there, hands them over to Gran and says, my, what big eyes, teeth you have. And the wolf jumps out. He's eaten Granny. He's about to eat Little Red Riding Hood. And that's where we leave the story. That's where we leave the story. We forget to tell the rest of the story. The hunter comes in, slugs the wolf, out pops Gran unharmed. I mean, that always happens, doesn't it? And everyone lives happily ever after. So in your grief, tell the whole story. I am broken. My dad is dead. I didn't realize the relationship we had. He's suffering COVID. I couldn't visit him. That's all true. But there's more to that story. He gave me the courage to try and fix things when I don't have the capacity to. There's so many handymen out there who love me because I make things worse. And they earn so much more. He gave me my sense of humor. He gave me my love for the sea. Love for lemon meringue pie. Etc. That's the rest of the story. I don't need to deny the wolf and the fear. I own that. there's so much more of the story to tell. I will see him again in heaven, although the truth is when I get to the pearly gates, he won't be there to greet me. He will be in his favorite place, on the toilet in heaven. This friend of mine who passed away, she helped me with all the funerals in COVID. We did about 260 together. And we always try to find something personal to represent the person's life for the families. So she said to me, we had a little tea after Dad had died. She said, Gavin, can I put something together that just represents his life? I said, absolutely. She found a little model toilet, and made a little homemade toilet paper to represent his life. And see, that's the rest of the story. Are you with me? So tell the whole story. All right, learn to love the new you. Those of you who've lost loved ones, you're not the same. Are you? We're not the same. And we've got to learn to love the new person that we are. Because God can use that person, love that person as much as the previous one. And in some sense, we're wiser. And we're more deep. And we're more mature. And we don't mess, or we don't tolerate people who push in the queue in front of us. Okay, we're nearly there. And then just be open about your journey. I made a conscious decision about 3 months ago to stop talking about this friend of mine who died because the people around me just don't get it. Aren't you over it yet? And then I realized that I was killing her by being quiet about my journey. If they don't get it, that's their problem. Honor the deceased. Get teddy bears made out of their clothes. Get a tattoo. Put a picture up. Keep a bowl of sweets on your desk. Don't be afraid to celebrate their lives. Give your children their names, whatever it is. To remind yourself, this person is worth missing.
And you see, if you stop talking about them, then they truly are dead.
The ancient Egyptians believed, and that's why they had all the pyramids and everything. When you stop saying a person's name, that is when they die. And then don't feel guilty on the days when you're okay. Don't feel guilty on the days when it doesn't hurt. All right. Okay. Good. You can do it through ashes, putting your ashes in place. You can now get your ashes tattooed onto you. You can have your ashes in jewelry, memorials. See, I put there memory eels. Whether it's a plaque at the church, whether it's a picture at home, you can just be so creative in the ways in which you honor them. Keep their name alive. All right. Seek help if you're not coping. A doctor, a psychiatrist, a minister, a friend. Okay? All right. Good. Questions? I'm sorry I've gone on so long.
I'm sorry I was away with your first one.
Oh, no, it was better. You wouldn't have come back if you'd been at the first one. Yes, Jackie?
Is there, I quite liked your concept of getting stuck in grief and seeing that as a problem. But is there, I don't know, sort of people who, I'm gonna use an example of, I don't think of anyone here, but let's say like someone who's lost a child who every single night still lights a candle for them, 20 years later still hasn't touched their room. Like at what point does that become unhealthy and how do you know?
Doesn't.
So anything kind of goes what they need.
That's not unhealthy. If lighting a candle every night keeps them going, then it's working.
But is it keeping them going or is it holding them back?
I think it's giving them the strength to carry on. And you have to do it case by case scenario. So if someone's drinking a case of whiskey every night, that's holding them back. But if it's constructive, so I don't know if I told you last time, but in my first congregation, I don't think think you would know them, but Mina's husband died 15 years before I got there. And when I got there, her husband's clothes were still behind the door where he hung them. And that worked for her. And everyone kept on telling her daughter in particular, take it down, take it down, take it down, take it down. 4 years later when I left, before I left to go to PE, she said, would you help me take it down? And I helped her take her pants down and the shirt down off the hanger, and we had a little service and all the rest. And she was dead 6 weeks later. Now, it worked for her. She functioned, she was involved in the church, and that is what worked for her. It's a fine line, what holds you back and what keeps you from going forward. The very first machines I had to switch off was for a 19-year-old in Port Elizabeth. They think she'd had an aneurysm while she was swimming, and she was brain dead. It was terrible. And the parents had a memorial, or they put the ashes in their garden, which I advised them against, because now you're bound to their property. They're still living in the same house in PE. And I did the sister's wedding about 5 years ago. Must have been a huge age gap between them now I think of it. But and I was speaking to the parents at the reception afterwards and just asking how it's going and all the rest. And the mother says, it's fine. Every now and then I'll go and sit in the garden and have a cry, and then I'm fine again. So that memorial's still there, gives them comfort when they need it, and then they move forward. So on a case-by-case basis.
I knew a lady, I didn't know her well, she was a friend of a friend, and I did catering for them a few times. Her daughter passed away, and I haven't lost a child, I can't even imagine. Staunch Catholics, and so they buried her.
Right.
So her grave is here somewhere. All of her other children, siblings, the whole family, they've all immigrated. Her husband wanted to go to Australia. She will not leave her daughter's grave.
Yeah.
And I don't know,
That's and that is an example of being bound by a thing. And it could be psychological, it could be practical, sure.
Yeah.
And that's why I advised against this family. They're getting on. So, she died 25 years ago. And, she was in her 20s. So you can project how old the parents are now. They're going to start looking at retiring, moving to retiring home. They can't.
Feel stuck there.
Yeah. It's a tough one. Any other thoughts or questions?
Kevin,
Yes,
I
Alan.
might have a bit of a contradiction there. I still have my late wife's wedding dress. It's in the flat.
Okay.
But I'm busy packing up my house. And I'm having this huge problem in getting rid of my wife's sewing machine. How does that work?
So that sewing machine represents something to you, and I'm afraid I'm a bit different from everyone else. And I would say to you, so what? Keep the sewing machine. If it represents something that's meaningful to you, keep the sewing machine. Do you know what I mean? Most people say, oh, get over it and all the rest. I'm saying, no. If that represents something to you. So this friend of mine who passed away, it was a suicide, and her husband had asked her for a divorce beforehand, and her daughter had emigrated, and she couldn't cope with this. And she was very creative, and her lounge was pink, and she made a pink dressing table, these pink fluffy chairs, and oh my word, you just got a tan when you walked in there. And the moment she died, he took everything out and put it into a salon. He's painted everything this dark grey, and it was like he just wanted to get rid of everything. Now his daughter, who lives in the UK, is panicked about one thing being sold or given away. And so you have the same stuff that someone just wants to get rid of and someone else doesn't want to let people are just so different. So some people don't want any stuff because it reminds them. And some people just want to hold on to it because when they give it away, they feel like they're giving away part of the person. And if we come back to the first point, do what you need to do as long as it's not destructive. If you need to hang on to the sewing machine, hang on to it. Just learn to make some clothes as well. Right. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts? Good. Thank you for your patience. I know we've gone on so long. So what I think we're going to do is just go into a time of prayer, if we can do that. All right. Shall we pray? Lord Jesus, as we sit here tonight, so each of us carry in front of us the picture of a loved one that we've lost. And that picture will conjure up for us different emotions. Maybe we can hear their voice. Maybe we remember the smell, deodorant or perfume. Maybe we can picture them laughing or crying or doing an activity or in a moment that was so profound for us. And for some of us, this will bring tears to our eyes. For others, fond recollection. Some of us, memories. Father, we take a moment in the silence of our hearts to just share with them, as though we were speaking to them now, where that image leaves us and how we're feeling. Lord Jesus, we see you now enter into the picture and come and take their hand. And they walk with you in this glorious light and peace and love. And you turn to us and remind us that they're okay, that they're well, and they're happy, filled with your joy and your peace and your forgiveness. And there's a part of us that wants to hold on, never let them go. There's another part of us that is so grateful that they are whole again. And we're certain that there will be a day where you come and take our hand and take us to where they are. And so we pray, Jesus, that you would be gentle with us. That you'd hold us in our brokenness. That you would reminisce with us in our remembering, that you would sit Shiva with us in our depression, that you would energize us as we figure out ways to take up life again, and that you would share your peace and your joy in those moments where we learn to live even in the face of our loss. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you for helping us process a little more of what has been taken from us. Thank you for reminding us of how sacred